November 14, 1944. Leyte Island, Philippines. Sergeant Michael Halloran crouched behind a shattered coconut palm, his hands bleeding from the recoil bruises that had split his knuckles open. The weapon across his lap looked like an M1 Garand that had been stretched on a torture rack. It was longer, heavier, and when it fired, the concussion could rupture eardrums at 15 feet. He had just put a round through 8 inches of reinforced concrete at 200 yards, turning a Japanese machine gun nest into a cloud of pulverized stone and screaming men. His shoulder was dislocated. His spotter was unconscious from the muzzle blast, and Division Command had explicitly ordered him never to fire the thing again. But the pillbox on the ridge was still there, and his company was pinned down in the open, dying in the mud. Halloran pressed the next round into the magazine. It looked like something stolen from a tank's ammunition rack, because that is exactly what it was. He pulled the bolt back, felt the cartridge seat with a metallic click that sounded like a vault door closing, and thought about the engineers who had promised this wouldn't kill him. They had been lying. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. The weapon Halloran carried into the Philippine jungle was officially designated the T-13 rifle grenade launcher, but no one called it that. The men who used it called it the Garand cannon, the shoulder breaker, or sometimes just the Widowmaker. It was a rifle's grenades hybrid designed in late 1943 at Springfield Armory, when ordnance engineers realized they had a problem that couldn't be solved with existing infantry weapons. American forces were advancing across the Pacific into increasingly fortified Japanese positions. Concrete bunkers, reinforced pillboxes, cave complexes blasted into coral rock. Standard rifle grenades bounced off. Bazookas required close approach under fire. Artillery was effective but slow to coordinate and often unavailable in jungle terrain. What infantry squads needed was something that combined the portability of a rifle with the penetration power of a tank shell. The concept was not entirely new. The Germans had experimented with rifle-mounted anti-tank grenades. The British had developed the PIAT, a spring-loaded launcher that fired a shaped charge. But what the Americans attempted was different in both scale and ambition. They wanted to fire an actual high-explosive anti-tank projectile from a modified rifle platform, using the rifle's own action and a dramatically reinforced chamber. The engineering challenge was immense. A standard M1 Garand fired the .30-06 Springfield cartridge, generating around 2,800 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. The proposed grenade round would generate over 15,000 foot-pounds, a force comparable to some anti-tank rifles. The weapon would need to absorb and redirect recoil energy that could shatter bones, rupture organs, or simply tear itself apart. The first prototype exploded during testing, sending shrapnel through a sandbag wall and into a wooden observation tower. The second cracked its stock on the 4th shot. The third worked, barely, but left the test shooter with a concussion and a fractured collarbone. Michael Halloran learned about the Garand cannon in a way that typified the chaotic improvisation of Pacific War logistics. He was a squad-designated marksman in the 96th Infantry Division, known for steady hands and an uncanny ability to estimate range without instruments. In October 1944, his unit landed on Leyte as part of the campaign to retake the Philippines. The fighting was immediate and brutal. Japanese forces had fortified the inland ridges with interconnected bunker systems, each one a miniature fortress of logs, coral stone, and concrete. Standard infantry tactics stalled. Flamethrowers required suicidal approach distances. Satchel charges were effective but consumed engineers faster than they could be replaced. Then, without warning or explanation, a wooden crate arrived at the battalion command post. Inside were 4 modified M1 Garands with extended barrels, reinforced receivers, and stocks wrapped in layers of leather padding. Alongside them were 40 rounds of ammunition that looked like miniature artillery shells, each one hand-labeled with production dates and warning stickers that read, "Experimental use only. Extreme caution." The battalion commander, a colonel named Drayson who had lost a brother at Tarawa, looked at the weapons with the expression of a man who had just been handed a live bomb. He asked if anyone in the battalion had experience with heavy weapons and precise shooting under stress. Halloran's company commander volunteered him without asking. That afternoon, Halloran held the weapon for the first time and knew immediately that something was wrong. The balance was off. The center of gravity was too far forward. The barrel, nearly 4 inches longer than standard, had a muzzle brake that looked like it belonged on a 37mm anti-tank gun. The trigger pull was stiff, over 12 pounds, designed to prevent accidental discharge. When he worked the action, the bolt moved with a heavy, grinding resistance. This was not a rifle. It was a cannon that happened to be shoulder-fired, and everything about it suggested that firing it would be an act of controlled violence against the shooter as much as the target. Training, if it could be called that, consisted of a single afternoon on a makeshift range hacked out of jungle near the beachhead. An ordnance lieutenant from Springfield Armory, pale and sweating in the humidity, walked Halloran through the loading procedure. The grenades were not grenades in the traditional sense. They were fin-stabilized projectiles with shape-charged warheads designed to penetrate armor plate or reinforce concrete. Each round weighed just under 2 pounds. The propellant charge was contained in a steel cartridge case that looked like an oversized shotgun shell. Loading required inserting projectile into the muzzle, then chambering the propellant cartridge in the modified receiver. The bolt had to be closed slowly and firmly to ensure proper alignment. Any gap, any misalignment, and the weapon could detonate in the shooter's face. The lieutenant emphasized the importance of stance. Feet shoulder-width apart, weight forward, stock pressed tightly into the pocket of the shoulder, cheek off the stock to avoid facial injuries from recoil. He demonstrated once, firing at a target log 80 yards downrange. The sound was not the sharp crack of a rifle, but a deep, concussive boom that Halloran felt in his chest cavity. The log disintegrated. The lieutenant staggered backward 3 steps, his face gray, and immediately sat down. He did not fire again. Halloran's turn. He loaded the weapon, checked the alignment twice, settled into the stance. The lieutenant moved 20 feet away and covered his ears. Halloran exhaled slowly, found his sight picture, and squeezed the trigger. The world exploded. Not just sound, but pressure, a physical wall of concussive force that hit him like a truck. His shoulder felt like it had been struck with a sledgehammer. His vision went white for half a second. When it cleared, the target, a coconut palm trunk 2 feet in diameter, had a hole punched clean through it. The edges of the hole were smoking. Halloran's hands were shaking. His ears rang with a high, continuous tone that would not stop. The lieutenant was saying something, but Halloran could not hear him. He looked down at the weapon, still intact, smoke curling from a muzzle brake, and thought very clearly that this thing was going to kill him. The first combat use of the Garand cannon occurred on November 11, 1944, during an assault on a ridgeline designated Hill 522 by division maps. Japanese forces had established a network of bunkers along the ridge, each one positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire across the approaches. Standard infantry attacks had failed twice, with casualty rates exceeding 40%. Artillery strikes had collapsed some of the surface structures, but left the deep bunkers intact. Battalion command decided to commit the experimental weapons. Halloran and 3 other riflemen, each issued a Garand cannon and 20 rounds, were attached to the lead assault company. The plan was simple to the point of desperation. Advance under covering fire to within 200 yards of the bunkers, then engage with the grenade launchers while infantry squads maneuvered for close assault. No one mentioned what would happen if the weapons failed, or if the shooters were killed before they could fire. At dawn, the company moved up the ridge through waist-high kanai grass, moving in short rushes between patches of cover. Mortar fire began almost immediately, Japanese crews dropping shells with practiced accuracy. Men went down in clusters, torn apart by shrapnel or simply disappearing into the smoke and noise. Halloran moved with a spotter, a kid from Ohio named Perkins who carried extra ammunition and a pair of binoculars. They reached a shallow depression 200 yards from the first bunker and went to ground. Perkins glassed the target, called out the range and wind, then looked at Halloran with an expression that mixed fear and excitement. Halloran loaded the first grenade, chambered the propellant cartridge, and settled into his firing position. The bunker was a low concrete dome with a firing slit facing downslope. He could see the muzzle of a machine gun traversing slowly, searching for targets. He placed his sight picture on the left edge of the firing slit, exhaled, and fired. The recoil was worse than he remembered. The weapon slammed back into his shoulder with enough force to lift him partially off the ground. His vision went gray at the edges. He felt something tear in his shoulder, a hot, sharp pain that radiated down his arm. But he stayed conscious, kept his eyes open, and saw the result. The grenade hit low, impacting the base of the bunker just beneath the firing slit. There was a sharp crack, then a secondary explosion as the shaped charge detonated. A section of the concrete wall blew inward, sending fragments and dust erupting from the slit. The machine gun went silent. For 3 seconds there was no movement. Then smoke began pouring from the opening. Halloran did not wait to see if anyone emerged. He was already loading the second round, his hands moving automatically despite the pain. Perkins was yelling something, pointing at another bunker further up the ridge. Halloran shifted position, found the new target, fired again. The second shot hit clean, punching through the firing slit and detonating inside. The bunker seemed to bulge, then collapsed inward as the roof gave way. He could hear screaming from inside, thin and distant. The infantry squads were moving now, rushing the remaining positions under cover of smoke grenades. Halloran fired twice more, each shot a hammer blow to his body, each impact a small explosion of concrete and earth. By the time the company secured the ridge, he could not lift his right arm above his waist. His shoulder was swollen to twice its normal size, the skin mottled purple and black. Perkins had to help him stand, but the weapons had worked. The bunkers were destroyed. The company had taken the objective with less than 10% casualties. And Division Command, despite their earlier orders, suddenly wanted more. The success on Hill 522 triggered a rapid and largely uncontrolled proliferation of the Garand cannon across the Leyte front. Ordnance depots rushed additional weapons and ammunition forward, often without proper training materials or safety protocols. By mid-November, nearly 30 rifles had been distributed to frontline units. Some went to designated marksmen like Halloran. Others went to whoever was available and willing to risk using them. The results were predictably chaotic. In some units, the weapons performed exactly as intended, destroying bunkers and pillboxes that had resisted days of conventional assault. In others, mechanical failures, improper loading, or simple bad luck led to catastrophic accidents. A sergeant in the 7th Infantry Division suffered a ruptured receiver that sent bolt fragments through his neck, killing him instantly. A corporal in the 32nd Division fired at too steep an angle, and the recoil drove the stock upward into his jaw, shattering bone and teeth. Another shooter, firing prone instead of kneeling, absorbed the full recoil force through his spine and was paralyzed from the waist down. The weapons were effective, brutally so, but they demanded a price from the men who used them. Word of the new weapon spread quickly through Japanese intelligence networks. Interrogated prisoners reported that American forces were deploying a new type of rifle that fired explosive shells. Japanese commanders, already struggling with supply shortages and the relentless American advance, interpreted this as evidence of a fundamental shift in infantry firepower. Some reports, filtered through translation errors and battlefield confusion, described the weapon as a portable cannon or a small artillery piece. One intelligence summary, recovered after the war from a Japanese division headquarters, referred to the weapon as a fortress killer, a term that combined both fear and grudging respect. The name stuck, passed from unit to unit, and became part of the grim folklore that surrounded American infantry capabilities. Michael Halloran fired the Garand cannon 14 more times during the Leyte campaign. Each shot compounded the damage to his shoulder until the joint was a mass of torn ligaments and bone fragments. Medics told him he needed surgery and evacuation, but he refused. His reasoning was simple and brutal. As long as he could still fire the weapon, his squad had a tool that could save lives. The moment he left, that tool left with him, and men would die because the bunkers could not be breached. So he stayed, dosing himself with morphine before each engagement, bracing the weapon against his left shoulder when the right became unusable, and firing until the targets were destroyed or he ran out of ammunition. Other shooters developed their own techniques for managing the weapon's violence. Some wrapped their shoulders in layers of canvas and padding, creating makeshift recoil buffers that added bulk but reduced injury. Others fired from improvised rests, using logs or sandbags to absorb part of the recoil energy. A few, mostly larger men with experience in heavy weapons, simply endured, accepting the bruises and fractures as the cost of effectiveness. But no technique could fully mitigate the fundamental problem. The weapon generated more force than the human body could safely absorb, and every shot was a gamble that the body would hold together for one more trigger pull. The psychological toll was less visible, but just as damaging. Firing the Garand cannon required a mental discipline that bordered on dissociation. The shooter had to ignore the screaming pain signals from his body, suppress the instinctive flinch response, and maintain focus through a level of physical trauma that would normally trigger unconsciousness. Some men managed this through sheer stubbornness. Others relied on anger, channeling their fear and exhaustion into a cold, focused rage. A few simply broke, unable to force themselves to load and fire the weapon a second time. There was no shame in this. The weapon asked too much, demanded sacrifices that went beyond the ordinary cruelties of infantry combat. By December 1944, the limitations of the Garand cannon were becoming undeniable. The weapons were effective in specific tactical situations, particularly against fortified positions at medium range, but they were too dangerous, too difficult to use, and too prone to mechanical failure for widespread deployment. The injury rate among shooters was approaching 60%, a figure that no amount of tactical success could justify. Ordnance engineers at Springfield Armory, reviewing field reports and casualty data, began work on a revised design that would incorporate lessons learned from combat use. The improved version, designated T-13E1, featured a heavier stock, a more effective muzzle brake, and a modified recoil system that used a hydraulic buffer to absorb impact. Prototypes were tested in early 1945 and showed significant improvements in shooter safety. But by then, the tactical situation had changed. American forces were increasingly reliant on tanks, flamethrower teams, and close air support to reduce fortified positions. The need for a man-portable fortress killer had diminished. Production of the improved Garand cannon was limited to experimental batches, and by the summer of 1945, the program was quietly discontinued. The original weapons were withdrawn from service, most of them destroyed or consigned to depot storage. A few survived, scattered across military museums and private collections, their barrels scarred and their stocks cracked from use. They remain as physical evidence of a moment when desperation and ingenuity collided, when engineers tried to compress the firepower of a tank into the hands of a single rifleman, and when that rifleman paid the price. Michael Halloran survived the war, though survival is a complicated term. His right shoulder never fully healed. By 1946, the joint had deteriorated to the point where even basic movements caused severe pain. He underwent multiple surgeries, each one providing temporary relief but no permanent solution. By his 30s, he had lost most of the range of motion in his right arm. By his 40s, he could no longer work. He spent his later years in a Veterans Administration hospital in Pennsylvania, where he rarely spoke about the war and never mentioned the weapon. When researchers from Springfield Armory contacted him in the 1960s, asking for his recollections of the T-13 program, he declined to participate. His response, delivered through a VA social worker, was brief. He said that he had done what was necessary, that the weapon had worked as intended, and that he had nothing useful to add. He died in 1978, his service records noting that he had been awarded a Bronze Star for actions on Leyte, but providing no details about what those actions had been. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service in a single sentence. There was no mention of the Garand cannon, no reference to the fortress killer, no acknowledgement that he had been part of one of the most extreme weapons experiments of the war. The weapon itself, the specific rifle that Halloran had carried on Hill 522, was destroyed in a depot fire in 1947. No photographs of him firing it survive. His name does not appear in any of the official histories of the T-13 program. He was, like so many others, an ordinary man who had done something extraordinary and then been forgotten. The legacy of the Garand cannon is not found in military doctrine or official histories. It is found in the margins, in the footnotes of ordnance reports, in the fading memories of men who saw the weapon used and understood what it cost. It is a reminder that innovation in war is often born from desperation, that effectiveness and safety are not always compatible, and that the men who use experimental weapons are conducting a form of human testing that no ethics board would ever approve. The weapon pushed the boundaries of what a rifleman could be asked to do, and in doing so, revealed the limits of human endurance. It worked, in the narrow sense that it destroyed its targets. But it also destroyed the men who fired it, slowly and incrementally, shot by shot. There is a photograph, taken sometime in late 1944, that captures the essence of the Garand cannon's brief and violent service. It shows a group of soldiers gathered around a wrecked Japanese bunker on Leyte. The bunker's concrete wall has been breached by a large, irregular hole, the edges still smoking. In the foreground, a rifleman sits with his back against a fallen tree, his right arm in a makeshift sling, his face gray with exhaustion. Across his lap is a weapon that looks too large, too heavy, its barrel scored and blackened. He is not looking at the camera. He is looking at the bunker, at the hole his weapon made, and his expression is not triumph or satisfaction. It is something closer to resignation, the look of a man who has learned that every solution comes with cost, and that some costs are paid in blood and bone, and the slow erosion of the body's ability to endure. The technical specifications of the Garand cannon tell part of the story, but miss the human element that defined its use. The weapon fired a fin-stabilized grenade weighing approximately 1.8 pounds, propelled by a cartridge generating chamber pressures in excess of 45,000 pounds per square inch. Muzzle velocity was estimated at 450 feet per second, low by rifle standards but adequate for the projectile's ballistic profile. Effective range was between 150 and 250 yards, beyond which accuracy degraded rapidly due to grenade's unstable flight characteristics. Penetration capability varied with target composition, but field reports documented successful breaches of concrete walls up to 10 inches thick and log bunkers reinforced with earth and coral stone. The shape-charged warhead, when functioning correctly, produced a narrow jet of superheated gas and metal particles capable of cutting through armor plate. Against personnel, the effects were catastrophic, the concussive blast and fragmentation causing injuries incompatible with survival inside enclosed spaces. But these numbers and descriptions, precise and clinical, cannot convey what it felt like to fire the weapon, to absorb that punishing recoil, to feel the concussion in your chest and the pain radiating through your shoulder, to see the target explode and know that you had done that, and to wonder if you could do it again. The men who used the Garand cannon understood something that the engineers and theorists did not. A weapon is not just a tool. It is a relationship between the user and the machine, a bargain struck in metal and explosives. And some weapons demand too much from that relationship, ask sacrifices that cannot be justified by any tactical calculus. The story of the Garand cannon is also the story of the broader evolution of infantry weapons during World War II. The war accelerated weapons development at an unprecedented pace, compressing decades of incremental improvement into years of frantic innovation. Armies experimented with shaped charges, recoilless rifles, rocket launchers, and grenade launchers, each designed in an attempt to give individual soldiers a firepower previously reserved for heavy weapons teams. Some of these experiments succeeded and became foundational elements of post-war infantry doctrine. The bazooka, the Panzerfaust, the PIAT all demonstrated that portable anti-tank and anti-fortification weapons were tactically viable. But many experiments failed or succeeded only partially, or worked in theory but proved too dangerous or complicated for field use. The Garand cannon belongs to the second category. It was not a failure in the sense that it did not work. It worked, often spectacularly, but it worked at a cost that made sustained use impossible. The weapon existed in a narrow window of tactical necessity, when fortifications were dense and alternative weapons were scarce. Once that window closed, once other solutions became available, the Garand cannon became obsolete. Its brief service life, from October 1944 to early 1945, is a testament to both its effectiveness and its fundamental unsuitability for the demands of modern war. There were moments, though, when the weapon transcended its brutal mechanics and became something more. Halloran experienced one such moment in late November 1944, during a firefight on the outskirts of Ormoc. His platoon was trapped in a dried-up rice paddy, pinned down by fire from a reinforced bunker complex on a low hill. Artillery support was unavailable due to weather, and airstrikes were impossible under the low cloud ceiling. The company commander, a captain named Reese who had already lost 2 platoons that week, was preparing to order a frontal assault, a decision that would likely result in near-total casualties. Halloran, barely able to stand due to his shoulder injury and 3 days without sleep, asked for permission to try the Garand cannon. Reese looked at him, at the weapon, and nodded. Halloran moved forward alone, crawling through mud and rice stubble, until he was within 200 yards of the nearest bunker. He loaded the grenade, braced himself against the paddy dike, and fired. The shot was perfect. The grenade entered the firing slit and detonated inside. The explosion collapsing the bunker's interior supports and sealing the entrance. The machine gun went silent. Halloran loaded again, fired at the second bunker, missed, loaded again, fired again, hit. The third bunker saw what was happening and shifted fire toward him. Bullets chewed to the mud around his position, but he did not move. He loaded, fired, watched the bunker erupt in smoke and dust. 3 bunkers, 3 shots, less than 2 minutes. The company advanced, secured the position, and continued the attack. Reese found Halloran afterward, still lying in the paddy, unable to move. He said nothing, just helped him to his feet and walked him back to the aid station. That night, sitting on a cot in the battalion medical tent, Halloran tried to make sense of what he had done. He had fired a weapon that should have killed him, had destroyed targets that should have been impossible for a single rifleman to engage, and had saved men who would otherwise have died. The cost had been immense, his body wrecked, his future compromised. But in that moment, in the mud and the noise and the smoke, he had been exactly what the war demanded. He had been a fortress killer. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below. If this story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like him. The final chapter of the Garand Cannon story unfolded not on the battlefield, but in the quiet halls of military archives and the fading memories of veterans. After the war, the weapon was classified and largely forgotten, its existence known only to ordnance historians and a small number of survivors. Occasionally, a reference would surface in a memoir or an oral history interview, a brief mention of a rifle that fired grenades, a weapon that nearly killed its users. But these references were fragmentary and disconnected, pieces of a story that no one had bothered to assemble. In the 1970s, a researcher at the Army Heritage and Education Center in Pennsylvania began compiling records of experimental weapons programs from World War II. Among the thousands of documents, he found references to the T-13 and T-13E1 rifle grenade launchers, including field reports, casualty summaries, and technical specifications. The reports painted a clear picture. The weapons had been used in combat for approximately 4 months. They had destroyed or disabled an estimated 70 to 90 fortified positions. They had contributed to the success of multiple assaults across Leyte and later Luzon, but they had also caused injuries to more than half of their operators, including fractures, dislocations, concussions, and long-term disabilities. The program had been terminated not because the weapon failed, but because it succeeded at too high a price. The researcher published his findings in a small military history journal in 1982. The article was read by a few hundred people, cited in a couple of doctoral dissertations, and then largely forgotten again. But among those readers was a veteran named Joseph Carlin, who had served in the 96th Infantry Division on Leyte. Carlin remembered Halloran, remembered watching him fire the Garand cannon on Hill 522, remembered the sound and the smoke and the way Halloran had staggered afterward, clutching his shoulder. Carlin had lost contact with Halloran after the war, but had always wondered what had happened to him. He reached out to the Veterans Administration, filed inquiries, and eventually learned that Halloran had died in 1978. Carlin wrote a letter to the Army Heritage and Education Center, detailing what he remembered, providing names and dates and descriptions. His letter became part of the official record, one of the few first-hand accounts of the weapons used that included both tactical details and personal observations. Carlin died in 1995, but his letter remains, a small but vital link in the chain of memory that keeps stories like Halloran from vanishing entirely. The Garand cannon itself survives in fewer than a dozen examples, scattered across museums and private collections. Most are incomplete, missing barrels or receivers, their mechanisms frozen by decades of neglect. A few are fully functional, preserved as engineering curiosities or historical artifacts. One example, held by the Springfield Armory National Historic Site, is accompanied by a placard that describes the weapon's development, deployment, and discontinuation. The placard mentions the injury rate, the tactical successes, and the decision to terminate the program, but it does not mention Halloran or Carlin or any of the individual men who used the weapon. Their names are not recorded there. Their sacrifices are not acknowledged. They remain, as so many do, anonymous figures in the broader sweep of history. The story of the Garand Cannon is, ultimately, a story about limits. It is about the limit of what a weapon can ask from its user, the limit of what a human body can endure, and the limit of what military organizations are willing to sacrifice in a pursuit of tactical advantage. It is a story that challenges the comfortable narratives of technological progress and battlefield innovation, reminding us that every advance comes with costs that are often borne by individuals whose names we will never know. The weapon worked. It killed the enemy, saved friendly forces, and accomplished its mission. But it also broke the men who fired it, slowly and irrevocably, in ways that awards and commendations could never repair. Michael Halloran understood this. In the few times he spoke about the war to his family, he never framed his service in terms of heroism or sacrifice. He talked about necessity, about doing what had to be done because there was no alternative. He talked about the weight of the weapon, the sound it made, the way the targets disintegrated. He did not talk about pain, though his family knew it was constant. He did not talk about regret, though they suspected it was there. He simply acknowledged that he had been part of something that pushed the boundaries of what soldiers could be asked to do, and that he had survived, if survival could be defined as waking up each day with a body that no longer fully obeyed him. The Fortress Killer, the weapon that the Japanese feared and the Americans used and then discarded, was not really a weapon at all. It was a question posed in steel and explosives, a question about how much we are willing to demand from the men who stand between us and the enemy. Halloran answered that question with his body, with 14 shots that destroyed 14 targets and left him permanently disabled. And when the war ended, when the weapon was taken from him and locked away, he returned to a life that had been irrevocably altered by what he had done. There were no parades for men like Halloran, no monuments to the Fortress Killers. There was only the slow, grinding reality of living with the consequences of innovation.